So now we're ready to get into the meat of the training, the reason why you're here, trainers. And in this first training session, we are going to be looking at identification. In your protection SOPs, and you should have a copy with you at this training, and if you have enough in your budget to make copies for your participants, also provide that to them or give them electronic copies. It will be good for them to follow in some of the things that we will be doing, especially as we discuss this first part, talking about identification. So let's look at, for this first training module, what do we want to do? First, to provide a systematic guideline for the detection and screening of potential victims of trafficking in persons. We want to aid in the determination of those identified as victims so that we can inform the services that they will receive. We want to ensure that we streamline the identification process so that we adequately protect the rights of victims and we provide formal identification. As you know from your protection SOPs, the formal identification is done by the GPF tip unit, the Guyana Police Force tip unit, in collaboration with the C-tip unit. And so we want to ensure that the other persons who are assisting with detection, as we have set out in the protection SOPs, are making those referrals to those units for the formal identification process to begin. And one of the other objectives that we have for this module is to emphasize the respect for the views and concerns of victims, to ensure the protection of their rights, and to ensure that as much as possible they are included in the decisions concerning their participation in processes, and that they are volunteering and also giving informed consent. So let's get into it. What is detection? So detection is the first part of identification. And detection can happen at any time, at any place. Really, it's just based on observed indicators that are reported or referrals that are then made to the relevant agencies, which in this case will be the Guyana Police Force tip unit or the C-tip unit. It can be done by any member of the public. It can be done by a staff of a government agency, a staff or a volunteer of an NGO. It can be done by a government official while carrying out their regular duties, immigration, customs, the police, who come in contact with somebody that they believe is a potential victim of human trafficking based on indicators that are being exhibited. This detection process leads to a referral or a report. And once detection is done, then we're ready to move to the next step. This next step is looking at how we assess those indicators. Now, when we say indicators, what we're really looking at are those things that cause a red flag, something that you see in the situation that's been exhibited by this person that you're in contact with, whether it's in their demeanor, their behavior, something specific about them or the persons that are with them that causes you to think that something is not right. When you have that feeling that something is not right, then it should trigger some kind of reporting or a referral. And what we want for you to understand as it relates to human trafficking, that these indicators are based on the definition of trafficking in persons, the definition that is set out in the legislation, because this process aids the police, it aids the C-tip unit in being able to identify the elements of the crime. And the elements of the crime of human trafficking are one, the acts. And in the definition, we know that includes recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbor or receipt of persons. It includes the means, that's the second element of the crime. Those actions must be done by means that you incorporate threats, use of force, other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, abuse of position of vulnerability, giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of somebody that has control over another person. And the final element of the crime of trafficking in persons is purpose. That purpose must be for exploitation. And at a minimum, that exploitation means prostitution or involvement in sex work, other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, practices similar to slavery, servitude, the removal of organs, sale of persons. So when we see those actions of recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt that are done by the means that include threats or force or fraud that results in exploitative activities, then it's telling us this is something that needs to be reported. These are indicators that must go to somebody else for investigation. And in your protection SOPs. If you go to the protection SOPs, you will see under the section on identification, we have included a table that sets out several general indicators that are specific to children, indicators that are specific to the types of exploitation, the indicators in relation to the activities of sexual exploitation that you observe somebody may be participating in, activities of labor exploitation, activities of domestic servitude, indicators that are connected to illicit activities. So these are things that we want for you trainers to emphasize in the training, that these are the things that are being detected. These are the things that are observed. These are the things that the public or the official or the other person that sees that then triggers a report. It does not mean that because you see these things that trafficking has happened. It just tells you that there is a red flag, that this situation is a potential situation for trafficking in persons. In your training, we have also, as I said before, set out all of these group activities. And because identification is such an important part of being able to respond appropriately to victims, to ensure that we provide the right protection services, the right direct assistance, the right voluntary assisted return services and shelter services, we want for you now to take a break, and you are going to be placed in groups. So trainers, you will select the groups. You may have pre-selected your groups before the training activity started. If not, you can do so now. And we want for you to consider selecting groups either randomly or groups that are based on the agencies that persons are from, but try to have a good mix in each group that will allow different viewpoints to be aired. And so we want for you to organize this scenario. Usually we will recommend that you take 10 minutes for a scenario activity, and then you allow them to come back. They break away for the scenario, go into their groups to different parts of the room or to an adjoining room, or if you're outside, they can go under a tree. Try to use your location as much as possible to the comfort of your participants and to allow them the space to really relax and to take the activities and to really do the discussions that are necessary, because you want for them to really work through these scenarios, to think of how they will respond to it, to think of what they are seeing that's pointing to them of a possible indicator. So you will have several scenarios that we have provided for you within the training materials. You want to give one scenario to each group so that they each have something to discuss. They will have different scenarios, but they will have the same length of time to discuss them. Ask them to choose a presenter, somebody that will guide the presentation after the group has discussed, and will also allow them to have some kind of wrap up and to take notes of what everybody is discussing and to collate it and bring it together in a summary manner to be presented to the wider group. Allow time for the presentations to be made by each group, and then as they present and they do the presentations, you can have comments, or you can have the other persons from the other groups also share their viewpoint on each presentation. Allow each group to have their individual presentations, and trainers always remember to thank your participants for their presentations. Acknowledge the work that they have done, and you can also provide guidance if the group is getting stuck and they're having difficulty not being able to resolve the scenario. Point them back to the protection SOPs. The actual SOPs have guidance on how identification is done. It has guidance on all of the indicators, so they can always use that as a guide. But let them try to discuss it first and get their own viewpoint, and then to double check that with the protection SOPs so that they are keeping in line with what is being done. So once you give them those instructions and they have done their presentations and you comment on the presentations, you can continue with providing the rest of the information on identification. And you want to emphasize the purpose of identification. So you want for them to, once they have done their presentations, you want to ensure that you explain to them, okay, when we do identification, this is a formal process. It is the next step after detection. It takes what we observe as indicators, and it allows the agencies, the Guyana Police Force TIP unit, the CTIP unit, to formally look at those indicators, the reports that are being made, and to then determine, one, if more information is needed, They may need to do other activities to concretize and to validate the indicators that are reported by doing surveillance. They may need to do an rescue operation because the indicators are pointing to somebody being in danger and that immediate action is needed. So all of this is what identification allows. It allows the agencies to determine what is the appropriate next step and to then make the determination whether the person that is in the situation is to be declared and to be considered as a victim of trafficking in persons based on the available substantiating indicators. So steps for identification then include: 1, the measures that are taken to detect trafficked persons, the location, the different stage of trafficking that they may be in, the collection of information regarding their case, analyzing that information, and then of course making determination whether the person will be presumed or confirmed as a victim of trafficking, and what steps will be necessary to ensure that person's protection and assistance. Some guidelines for identification as we have set out in the actual protection SOPs themselves. 1, confidentiality. This is key. Once reports are made and once you, even as a person who is doing the detection, you detect and you report, you want to ensure that you are not creating any opportunity for confidentiality to be leaked or information to be leaked. That you always liaise only with the appropriate authorities, because the safety of those potential victims will be dependent on how we can restrict information and ensure that information does not go back to the traffickers or persons who are connected to them, because the victims might be harmed or they may be moved or relocated before assistance can be given to them. So confidentiality is key. The other important guideline is that we must be non-discriminatory and we must be victim-centered. This is why we have developed the protection SOPs. The protection SOPs put the rights of the victim, the protection of the victim at the center of the response. It requires the agencies that are responding to ensure that the officers have been trained appropriately, and this is why you are participating today in this training, because we want to ensure that you understand that you must interact with the victims on the basis of a victim-centered approach, the protection of their rights, and being sensitive to the fact that they have experienced trauma and ensuring that there is no kind of discrimination. And this is something that we have to guard against. Victims come to us in all shapes, sizes, ethnic groups from different backgrounds. They may be involved in illegal activity at the time they're identified as a victim. They may be involved in immoral activity at the time that they're identified as a victim. They may be participating in activities that personally you may have an objection to. This is where your professional response must come to the forefront, because you want to ensure that your objection to the victim and any activity that they may be involved in, or your objection to their background, does not influence the services that you provide. So we want for you to be guided by this principle of non-discrimination. We want for you also to consider your safety and the safety of the victim. So assume that there is going to be some risk. Assume that there may be a situation that you will have to plan for to ensure that the traffickers do not come after you and do not come after the victim. So assume the risk and plan for how you're going to address it, and keep the victim informed throughout the process. Once you have made contact with the victim, once you have made any steps to remove the victim or to provide services, you must keep them informed throughout the process. And you do that by ensuring that their case is registered with the CTIP unit once the report is made. You ensure that no presumed victim is charged or detained. You ensure that any interviews that are done, that they are coordinated with the CTIP and other relevant agencies, for instance, the child protection agencies in relation to children, and you ensure that those interviews are done in private areas where confidentiality can be maintained, where safety can be organized, and also that you are using interpreters where there are language barriers, cultural mediators for victims that come from indigenous groups or persons from different backgrounds where culture may affect how they interact with law enforcement agencies. And you want to ensure that you are informing them of their rights and that they understand what their participation in your process means for them, and then what are the next steps that are going to be done in terms of their protection and the assistance that will be given to them. Be very upfront and be very clear about this at the beginning. This is key. So as we continue, we want to give you some suggested sample questions that can help to guide in the identification process. Now, of course, the police and the CTIP unit have their formal checklists, and this is not to say that they are going to be using these questions. They may incorporate these or others, and they will determine what that identification process will be, but we want to allow you to understand what's going on as they are looking at the report and looking at the information that has been gathered. They want to consider if the person can leave their job or their situation freely. They want to know if they can come and go from the location as they please. They want to know if they have been threatened, if they try to leave, if they have been physically harmed, if they are in living conditions or working conditions that are unsafe, if they're able to sleep and eat, if they have a bed and proper facilities. They want to know if they've had any issues with being deprived of food or water or sleep, if they have to ask permission to eat or to get food or to sleep, if there are any locks and doors that are keeping them in a confined environment, and if their identification documents have been taken and who has them, if they're being forced to do something that they don't want to do. These are questions that can help us to identify the acts, the means, and whether there is exploitation, so that we can establish whether in fact this is a victim of trafficking and whether there is evidence that the crime of trafficking is being committed. I mentioned before that it's important to keep the victims informed of their rights. And we have in Guyana especially specific rights of victims that are protected by law. The legislation gives specific protections, and it's important for us to recognize as we provide services, even protection services, that those rights have to be maintained. First, they have a right to access shelter, necessities, food, medical care. Once they are declared victims, they have a right to counseling and psychosocial assistance. They have a right to protection, to privacy, to confidentiality. They have a right to make decisions about whether they want to cooperate with the law enforcement. Of course, we have to explain to them of some of the benefits that accrue to them under the legislation for their participation and cooperation, which affects their immigration status and those other kinds of things that are provided for in the legislation. They have a right to legal information, to know what their rights are so that they can make informed decisions about consenting to services and to procedures. They have a right to refuse to give information. They have a right to refuse participation if that is what you need to also explain to them what that will mean. In some cases where they refuse participation, they may not be able to access some of the additional benefits of being able to get long-term immigration status in the country and those other things that are given by law to persons who are remaining to participate in court processes. So you want to explain those things to them. Of course, they also have the right to contact their embassies, their consular agents, but you also want to ensure that you explain to them in terms of them being able to return to their countries of origin. They have a right to do that, but there is a process, especially within these protocols that we're doing the training on, of how that can be done in a safe way. So in some cases, they may say they don't want to stay here and they want to go back home. And then you have to explain to them that that is a process, and we will assist them with that process. When you're working with children, there are some special considerations for children that you need to pay attention to. Of course, as I said before, when you're working with any child, you need to have the Child Protection Agency involved. They have the legal mandate for protecting the rights of children, for ensuring protection services are provided to children. In some cases as well, you may have a situation where you have adults who are accompanying children, and you may not be able to readily identify whether those adults are in fact the legal guardians of those children. There may be issues with the documentation. And you are required to verify that. You're required to ensure that those persons who are claiming that they have legal rights over the children actually do. You are required to ensure that all action that is being taken is done in the best interest of the child. That is the prevailing factor. And the rights of the child in a situation of trafficking may have to be separated from the rights of the parent who has been trafficked with the child, or the rights of the adult that is accompanying the child, because that adult may have participated in the trafficking or the exploitation of that child. So those considerations must be taken into account, and that's usually being done by the CPA. Their social workers will usually perform those investigations, and they will be the ones that will guide the process and to let the authorities and the other agencies that are participating in the response know the appropriate manner in which the child will be contacted, the persons who will have the legal authority to sign documents, provide consents, the medical procedures, those kinds of things. They will provide the guidance on that. In addition, we want for you to know that in working with children, of course, it's not going to be the same as working with adults. The child may not be able to readily give information about their age, their address. Many victims of trafficking, especially children, experience cognitive issues. The memory trauma is something that impacts memory. Sometimes they are not able to remember things in a coherent way or in a chronological order. Particularly with children, they have difficulty piecing the story together in a way that makes sense. So you need trainers when you're doing this part of the training. Remind the participants, because your participants are most likely going to be persons from the shelters, the social workers, the persons that are working in the protection sector that will have the immediate contact with children. You need to remind them that at this point, their interaction with the child is more about ensuring the child is safe, providing emotional stability, building rapport, and ensuring that they provide any urgent medical care that the child needs, ensure that they're dealing with the emotional needs of the child, and those things actually take priority over any legal response, over any criminal procedures that the child may be required to participate in. And so we want for you to discuss this a little bit more, because it's very important for us to know that we must interact with children differently from how we interact with adults who are victims. So we have another breakout room activity that's set up in the training at this point. So trainers, this is where you would again give the instructions for the breakout room activity, to advise them to go back to the rooms that you have already set up for the breakout activities in the groups that they have already been assigned. You will give them the scenario and the instructions for this activity. It is on the PowerPoint that you will have there. There are some questions that they will have to discuss when they look at this activity in relation to how they will respond to children. And you give them again 10 minutes to do this, and then after they have done the discussion, you ensure that they appoint a presenter from each group, that the presenter presents what they have discussed, and then after that, any wrap-up points that you may want to add as the facilitator to bring everything together and ensure that any questions that are still lingering, that you answer those questions, and then you are ready to wrap up this module. You would have completed the module on identification. You can point them to your protection SOPs and the identification flowchart, which would be on the next slide in your presentation. That sort of presents the flow of services. So we move from detection to identification and the different agencies that are responsible for interacting with victims at this point, the different things that are being done. You will see the indication of the reflection period. Now, the reflection period is not mandated by law, but it is an international best practice that is being recommended. Now, in some cases, it may be done. In some cases, it may not be done. The use of the reflection period really depends on the trauma needs of the victim. If you have a child or a victim that is exhibiting a lot of signs of trauma, they need time to really settle in their environment, to settle within the shelter, to think about whether they want to go back home or they want to stay here and participate in the court proceedings, to think about what assistance they want, if they are family members back home that will need assistance. If it's somebody who was a Guyanese person who was victimized in another country who has now returned to Guyana, they may have to make decisions about whether they want their family members to be notified of their presence here, how they want to interact with those family members now. So this reflection period gives them that time to really think about what their needs are, what services they will require from you, and how they can best participate in their own recovery. So we highly recommend it. It can be anywhere from 7 to 10 days, and sometimes it may be more if the counselor who is working with the victim advises that this person will need more time to achieve emotional stability so that they can give informed consent to services that are going to be given to them. And so you have come to the end of your module on identification. You, at this point, trainers, depending on whether you're doing this as part of a one-day activity or as a separate module, this is where you can incorporate one of the energizer activities that we have in the training. At this point in the training, we have one of the energizers called the office or treasure hunt, where you give them some instructions, and it can be, something simple as find something yellow in the room or find something green in the room, and you have 10 seconds to find it and bring it back to the main group. Depending on your location, the size of your location, of course, consider COVID requirements and any social distancing requirements that are required, and incorporate that as best as you can to keep people energized and to keep them motivated to continue. Or you may also want to take a short break at this time. This is the end of the module on identification.